Welcome to another great episode of Data Engineering Weekly. This time we are going to talk about Data Engineering Weekly edition 121. There are some exciting articles in 121, and we are going to pick 3 articles and we're going to deep dive on that. And we have Ashwin with us. Hi, Ashwin.
Hey, everyone. Happy to see you all again, or basically happy to speak to you all again because this is only going to be a podcast on the audio format. Hopefully you enjoyed some of our previous editions that we did. And I think looking forward to this particular topic, 121 again, a lot of topics which are relevant to the current context and how the data space is evolving.
Yeah, totally. I think, a lot of interesting conversation happening around data product. And then I think we talked last edition also more on the data contract, data product side of it. And interestingly, ODA product and tech, ODA company kind of write about Xavier read a very interesting article, data as a product at ODA. I think by far it's a very comprehensive article that I have seen that written about practical implication. What are the practical pragmatic decisions they made in order to make data product in an organization. I really enjoyed reading this article. What do you think of this, Ashwin?
Oh, fantastic article by Javier, right? So I think there are 6 different principles that ODA has basically laid out to develop data products. They don't just talk about decentralization. That's what Zermatt basically talks about, right? Around data mesh paradigm, around decentralization, and encouraging people to apply product thinking on top of data warehouses or data assets. To data assets. Dashboards and everything that revolves around data. I think what ODA has basically done, I think, which is an extension of this blog in itself, is laid out these 6 principles, starting with domain knowledge and the discipline expertise, right? The second one is focused around who owns the data and then having a common set of shared data governance, which is all about distributed data ownership. The third principle is around delivering data as a product. I think that's what we'll talk about during the course of the next 7 or 8 minutes. More importantly, I love the 4th principle that they have documented very well. Enablement over handovers. So in a typical data project, what we do is once we have loaded the data, we do a handover to support teams or to teams that are involved in monitoring the workflows and to the business teams or the technique or the functional teams and say, hey, I've loaded the data. This is how we load it, and then go from there. I think enabling them is all about helping them see the value inside and also us realizing the value, right? So it's just not handing over once it's done, but driving it continuously, right? Enablement is a continuous process, like learning. Learning is a continuous process. Impact through exploration and experimentation. Finally, adding privacy first architecture, right? Which is around proactive attitude towards privacy and data ethics. All of these are like the guiding principles. And the topic that we are going to deep dive right now is around data products.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things I really like in this article, essentially the whole data product principles, like the structure been built on top of the core values instead of kind of reflecting any industry jargons. I think that's a very, very good approach and a very interesting way of looking to this one. Even though underlying the concepts are kind of reflecting on those jargons, but building from the core value, what the team is delivered for, what it stands for, their value and the vision statements, and then building on top of this whole structure. I think that's a very interesting approach. Any organization that wanted to kind of follow that, really, very good reference there. And I also kind of particularly like this enablement over handovers. It kind of reminds me of, at Slack, when I was working there, it was written in one of the value design principle is kind of written. It's like, don't make me think. Like, don't make your users think. If the moment you make your users to think, you lose your value proposition as a platform or a product. I think that kind of reflect enablement over handovers.
Perfect example, actually. I think very accurate for this use case also. Right?
Yeah.
And one of the other things I think I liked about this entire principle that they've laid is quantified, and they have very clearly defined defining why data is a product. I think that's very important. I think organizationally, they have made the movement, but then they've also documented the challenges that they would have faced. And I think that's what we also need to think when we are implementing the same principles of mesh or data products. It's important that we are building all of these to lower the cost of discovering, understanding, trusting, and ultimately creating value for the data. I think all of these go hand in hand. I think it's very well documented in this particular blog. And it goes on to discover and discuss around the different types of data products, which I will be talking about. Me and Anand will be talking about in a short while. And it's pretty fairly well documented. And I would strongly encourage you to read the blog, which appeared in the 121 edition. But then before we go further, what according to you is a data product, right? Just make a mention, make a comment, post on LinkedIn, hashtag Data Engineering Weekly and tag Anand. We would like to hear your perspectives on what you think makes data as a product and what is data as a product in your perspective.
Right, totally. I think finding a definition itself is kind of another data product in my opinion.
Yeah, oh, God, that's a good one.
Yeah, and why data as a product, the author kind of explained the whole organizational structure of it, right? Like data and insight as a platform, and the domain built on top of it, and data product consumers built on top of it. It's very, very interesting approach. It essentially says platform enables the domain enables your consumer. It's a chain of value proposition, value creation going on top, and simplifying everyone's life, accessing data, making informed decision. It's a very good approach on decentralized, distributed approach to data ownership. Very interesting perspective.
Perfect. Yeah. Very interesting. One thing I observed here, right? I think something that we all need to take away that I need to check. I think we need to definitely check with Xavier around how it's coming up and how is it working up. Where he says any data set that is shared outside of a team is called a data product, right? So essentially anything that goes away from my team. So if you're working in marketing data engineering team, anything that you produce as an output should be considered as a data product, but not necessarily. And he also basically lays down the principle saying that not every data set is a data product. You got to apply all the product management principles, and he basically documents each of this, right? So, and I think just drilling down, I think it's wonderfully laid. So in a typical warehouse architecture, what do? We bring the data from source, we put it into a staging layer, they call it as a raw layer here. And from there, it goes to stage, model, and a serving layer. And each of these layers are then described. But then, very importantly, the data that lands in the raw layer or the stage layer is usually not a data product, but these are more intermediate steps that you do. The data product is created in the model layer, right? The model layer is where typically your business consumers start querying the data, or you start pulling a BI report on top of the model layer. Usually on the sub layer, but then it can also be on the model layer, right? So the data product also essentially means a table that's created on the raw layer is not a data product. Something that's modeled, something that has gone through some processing steps, right, becomes a data product. I think in one of the sessions, I mean, you had some points.
Yeah, I kind of tend to disagree with that, because let's say the raw layer data comes in here, right? It has to be originated by some domain team before bringing in some kind of a centralized storage. So that's where the raw data comes in, and then it kind of getting modeled. But if the raw data itself is not produced as a product, it's not being incorporated in any feedback loop from the instrumentation side, the modeling will not stand, because your underlying principles of creating this data, it's not at all aligned, right? For example, let's say somebody wanted to build a user model, and so some team has to emit the user event, some domain event has to be emitted.
Yeah.
But the domain team just emit user ID and username. It's still a user object. It's still some kind of user information coming to you, but you cannot build a comprehensive data product. Your completeness will not be there.
Yeah.
So I believe that capturing that particular interface, that is also kind of transferring from one team to another team, right? Usually a feature team or some kind of a third-party system, you're kind of emitting the data. Somebody has to own that. Somebody has to make sure that has a completeness and quality standards that are adhered to, and a proper escalation chain associated with that. So I would really put that raw layer also, like kind of raw layer when I mean like the data very first stage where the data comes sourced, like you create the sourcing of the data. I believe that need like a lot of product thinking. What do you think, Ashwin?
Oh yeah, yes. See, but then raw layer usually is a replica, and then they move to stage. So I think from raw to stage, they should start thinking. But then usually nobody follows 4 stacks as they follow in order. In our world, Anand, we only have the 3 layers, right? So raw, then you say modeled, and then the serving layer, or raw, curated, and the serving layer, right? So the consumption layer. So 3 stack. Then we should have some. I think product thinking starts earlier on. Because if it should start from understanding why I need to bring the data into my source in the first place, right? I think contract first is what we usually talk about. So start with understanding business requirement, and then go towards the left and understand which data needs to be bought in, and only bring data that is necessary for you. Don't bring everything into your raw and then make a dump yard or a graveyard in your raw layer also. Right. But then very interestingly, right? So the blog also talks about how ODA is structured, right? So they have pipelines and data sets that are actually built for every layer, right? And they also focus on modeling. In my word, more than modeling, it's contracts that I think ODA should be referring to. Modeling and contracts are very important in my point of view. And they focus on one pointer, right? The product that I produce should not break somebody else's pipeline. So they're independent of each other, so that my product is my product. It has a guaranteed delivery rate. I think all of those that are good practices when building products.
Exactly. I think Xavier kind of narrowed and explained down the line is mentioning saying that staging models should generally be a data product. So I was kind of a bit confused with the raw and the staging. What he was trying to say that. So raw data that, as you mentioned, like replica comes in, but they kind of create the data from building into a staging layer before doing the modeling. I think that interface they started to treat as a data product. I think it's the right approach in my opinion. So it's kind of that's what I was trying to say. That staging layer is kind of a raw layer, but they have like 2 different layers associated with that. That's kind of very
correct. I think Anand, you're emphasizing is also, which is very important, right? Which is around what is a data product, and you start with the business requirement. I think that's the core. Understand what your business teams wants, and then go from there. So I think rightly put. I think that's essentially where I would also start, because data products is new, and this is a chance for us to change how we start consuming data, and hopefully this concepts come into reality.
Yeah. One interesting point in this blog that kind of highlighted, like, intermediate models are not data products.
Oh, fantastic.
That kind of a very, very interesting thought. Like even like in the last conversation that we had about, do we need to catalog everything? What does data catalog means here? And then do we need to catalog everything? That goes back to this one, like, do we really need to capture everything in an intermediate data product? If you're taking apart from a lineage perspective, from a pipeline operational perspective, it really makes sense to kind of understand the whole end-to-end pipeline perspective. But from a business user's perspective, does it really necessary to kind of capture the intermediate model? That's a very, big question mark. And I think that defines how the data catalog space is going to evolve. And, Sanjeev Mohan kind of talking a lot about data product catalog. I think that's an interesting space to watch. And
probably kind of validates your thesis around catalog. Not everything needs to be catalog. So your intermediate tables are intermediate in its nature. So we will not be exposed to everyone in the organization except for the person who needs to consume these intermediate tables or data sets. It's there are data products. I think you're rightly said. But Anand, I think is dashboard or BI a data product?
Definitely, I would say dashboard should be a data product. I think what they kind of I really like the ways he was kind of narrowed down, like how the dashboard approach here. Right, and emoji based modeling, heavy users of Slack. I love emoji based workflows. clear emoji indication. This is an ad hoc analysis. This is a writing QA for data and insight. Quality approved. This is a set, like back at Slack, we had this notion called every dashboard. We have this notion called certified, certified data. So it's, which is our naming for data product. Back in 2016, we create like certified data essentially, or certified dashboard. This is certified by the data team, which means that it has a strong SLA commitment, strong data quality commitment, and strong on-call support for you. If this dashboard is essentially break, it's kind of a severity 1 or step 0, depends upon the nature of the dashboard, and then we will do an on-call support as a high priority to kind of fix that one. So I would definitely say any dashboard that we see, that's an insight that we say that should be really backed by this data point.
Perfect. I think very interesting coverage that Xavier has done around calling BIS a dashboard, how they do it. Very interestingly, like Xavier has highlighted, once they started treating this as a product, they ended up deleting a lot of BI dashboards, right? I think whatever is not being used, I think the color coding, the emoji-based approach, all of that only helps. Because when we talk about BI as a data product, take any organization, I think wherever I'm working right now, I've got tons of Tableau dashboards. But then are people really using it? I use it to download across tab. So I think understanding usage, understanding what makes sense, and if people are using it is very essential. If not, remove those products. I think it then boils down to who owns, who delivers, and who's in charge for driving the enablement and the literacy programs, right? So everything comes hand in hand. The 6 principle that Oda has followed, I think, perfectly aligns in driving this data culture within the company.
Yeah. Zombie dashboards are a real thing. It costs money, it costs confusion. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
I think towards the end, the author's kind of talking about who owns the data product. I think this is going to be like a big hurdle for many companies to adopt data products. The Xavier's kind of narrow down, say like the domain team has the ownership of data product with the data managers and quality control associated with that, and how they kind of expose that one. But we also kind of highlighted the challenges, like the teams are ephemeral, teams can change, and how do we kind of do the transformation and an alignment around that part of it. I think there's a lot of tooling needs to be built on top of this to manage the ownership of a data product. I think that's definitely a big scope for a product like Schemata, maybe to kind of manage the ownership of a data products there.
Totally. I think this is the part. I think one thing is most of the folks are on board about building data products. Then who owns it? Should your domain teams own it? Should your data teams own it? I think what Xavier covers in this blog at the moment of this writing, and he wants that to be changed as well, is today the core data team at Oda basically own the central data and insights platform, which is the team that owns. They own most of the core data products, and anything that leverages these data products to create downstream data products are owned by the domain teams, right? So there's a mix and match of team ownership here. I think that's a part that would see a lot more optimization over the next couple of months and years. In an ideal world, we want the teams to work hand in glove to ensure that they are delivering products that can be trustable. But ideally, right, I think, and that's what everybody is pushing, that the data products needs to be owned by the domain teams, and the data teams are enablers of delivering the data products, but not about the ownership. I think, as you rightly said, Schemata and other data contract related companies, I think the role of them is helping them document and defining the ownership for the downstream consumers as well.
Right. I kind of not very comfortable with this whole ownership term. I would really prefer like RACI pattern, essentially who is responsible, who is accountable. The domain owners has a good context. They are accountable to deliver because they are delivering, impacting. But who is responsible to define the requirement? Who is responsible for defining the data quality standards? The consumers define what is good quality, what is bad quality. The producer doesn't define, essentially, right? Well, that's how every producer-consumer relationship works.
Very interesting perspective,
So,
Anand. So you're saying the RASI model embedded into the ownership itself, right? It's just not about who owns it, but it's about the entire RASI principles, and then all the teams align to that.
yes, so ownership essentially isolates, siloed, like you are to implement, you are to blame. It takes away the collaboration aspect. Data is inherently very social in nature. It has to be created collaboratively. It has to be defined by the user. It has to be, the boundaries has to be set by the users, and the producer has to produce that one. And if you like take an example of, like you are shopping for Amazon, for example, and you are going to buy certain things, and Amazon says like, I'll deliver it in 1 day. That's my SLA. The producer then ships those things.
Yeah.
And the consumer then use it and like, oh no, this is not the quality that I expected. Like I'm going to return that one.
Yeah.
So the quality will be always viewed from the eyes of the consumer, not from the eyes of the producer in the data side of it. Somehow I feel that that's a lost missing piece in order for us to kind of build this one. So I would really remove. I hope the industry kind of moved away from the ownership principle into responsible and accountability. A RASI form or a CA or that form, right? So
perfect. No, I think makes sense, Anand. I think you're now steering my brain, and I'm staring on the wall here and trying to put a RASI around data products, which makes and brings context. Essentially, I think that's what we do inherently. But then you're right. It's not about one owner. So the domain owner is just not responsible for everything. So put the structure, who needs to be informed when there is a failure, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be accountable, who is totally responsible for the entire thing. I think putting that, documenting it, even at the start of it, right? I think that's where the equations start proving themselves in. Yeah.
That's essentially what product thinking is all about. Like, let's say, for example, you are generating a user's, like maybe customer model, for example, and some consumer come and say like, hey, for the customer, I want latitude, which is my utmost important for my model building or my analytics. And they say, hey, this is what it is. So the producer now produce a high like data quality checks and all sort of standards associated with that to make sure the latitude, longitude. They don't need to worry about all the other attributes. There'll be like 20 other attributes that customers can have. You cannot apply data quality in all the times, in every attributes. Yeah. Now, that's your MVP. Essentially, you're delivering customer model to a specific consumer, to the specific need. And then the other consumer comes in and they say like, hey, you know what? You have a customer table, you have an email that's kind of very important for me to marketing. Can I consume your product? Okay, now you're promoting email in order for you to know holding the standard, right? So the product kind of evolve as adoption evolve, and every consumer bring their own unique perspective to that one and then move that one. But if you take ownership, then it takes like the producer has to go and talk to every consumer and like ask like, what is really important to you? That's like a waterfall model, never going to work out. I don't think.
Correct.
I think this conversation also kind of very nicely, sliding to the next topic for us. Something like Peter Burns write about some reflection on talking with the data leaders. I think in this blog, that's what he's kind of highlighting.
He's talking about ownership.
Ownership. It's all about the ownership, and then one of the fundamental questions are getting like, ownership is great. It can greatly improve the internal consumers, make their life much better, but at what cost to the producer? What is the expectation from the producer side of it? That's a larger question he was kind of putting it out, in all this data contract and data mesh, trying to solve this problem with a different way of thinking, and what do you think of this article?
I love this. In fact, this is a reflection on whatever we face. I think Peter Bruins basically kind of has summarized it. One sentence that stood out and that I was also lost in thought reading that is he asks the reader, why is the data so frequently unusable?
Yeah.
Right? We've got the right tech, we've got the tools, we've got the products to scale, but why is it still being unusable? Right? We've got so much volume of data, variety of data, we have the infrastructure to process. I think it got me into thinking around what is the problem here, kind of leading back to the previous conversation. Did we not have the right ownership, the right accountability to data, that they were not delivering it correctly, causing all the issues there? Were the domain teams not involved in driving the output of things that they know better, and where they're outsourcing it to the data teams and then expecting the data teams to do magic? And the data teams did not have the right business knowledge or the semantic knowledge. And they were trying to bring in catalog, semantic layer, and all of that to help people, but then somehow it did not work out. And probably that leads to why probably data mesh as a design principle, the whole notion of bringing in a contract first approach to designing data strategies, I think kind of comes in to address part of the challenges that we have traditionally faced. And I think I covered that in the last session. One of the challenges that we have had is we've always added layers on top of each other. We've never tried to solve the layer in itself, right? So we moved from a warehouse to another warehouse, or another storage to a better storage, better compute engine, and added layers to a problem, right? So the moment you feel that business users are not able to consume the data, you're now talking about semantic layer. Now you're talking about metric layer to solve a problem. You're talking about bringing in catalog to solve a problem, right? So I think we added more slices on top of it that now it has become an overhead in my point of view. I think taking a step backward and re-implementing the architecture. I think in the last session, Anand, you had highlighted about the importance of a data architect and why you don't see a lot of data architects in place right now. Probably the role for data leaders right now is to take the architect back and rework on some of these strategies, right? Reworking on that in a way that they're able to bring in a contract first approach, bring in domain first approach towards the data problem, right? And bring in an accountability standard, bringing an organization-wide standard where there is an incentive to be responsible for the management of data. And I think it kind of leans towards, in my point of view, towards the data mesh principles, right? So that's where you're saying domain teams own it, the domain team is responsible for the output. I think while not explicitly called out by Peter, that's the thing that I read between the lines.
Yeah, I think interestingly you mentioned about like the data increasingly losing its value, the usability declining as it grow. This is a phenomenon I've seen also as the organization grow, became very complex. The data also became very complex and it's inherently unusable. I think this is my theory behind that. Like my theory is that as the organization grow, the data volume grows. As the data volume grows, the usability of the data declining very fast. The reason why the usability of the data is declining, not because of the failure of the data platform, the failure is actually the success of a data leads to a failure of it on its own. For example, the weight of the success declining the quality of the product. Let's say take an example of customer model. You know, some like data team deliver the customer model here, and the latitude, longitude are most important. They focused on very fast. It's already done and well adopted. The whole pipeline is built on top of it. Once a data product is put it on the wild, any data asset, put it on the wild, and it gets some success, the word spread. So many teams will show an interest. Oh, I could use this customer table to do something else, and I can do this customer table to do something else, and using some other fields. What is happening here is because either by an organizational structure perspective or the lack of communication, lack of standard process associated with the like adoptions of further data consumers, there is no coordination happening between the consumers and producers. Producers don't really know who consuming the products.
Yeah.
And the consumer just started to do, oh, okay, the email is totally fine. I'm going to start doing this one. And the producer may not really focus on email. Some nulls might come, some incomplete data might come, some dirt can happen. And the model has to then break. And then suddenly it came as a surprise that the data is unusable. I feel like the fundamental the problem here is lack of that communication layer, lack of this product thinking, lack of this collaboration associated with that.
Yeah, I think that's a
Because
problem.
yeah. Lack of the collaboration leads to make it more unusable, and it's drilling down the company's back, not able to produce any value out of the data.
Yeah.
It's definitely $1 billion idea to solve.
It's anything that's also collaboration, right? So I think Slack kind of nailed it towards the end. On the collaboration side, on the business, for the business teams. But data teams talk a little bit more complex language, right? We talk table, attributes, schema structures, data types, formats that are different. So I think we need a product that kind of talks our language. And I think that's something probably Schema is building. We'll talk about that in another session.
Definitely. I mean, Slack is the best data catalog tool ever in the market right now. Sorry, folks, I can't help bringing data catalog again.
Oh yeah, Anant and data catalog have a love-hate relationship.
I guess it's my curse. That's great. Let's move on to the last article. It's about Raphael M. wrote about the great migration from Redshift to Snowflake. This is kind of like the contribution of Redshift to this whole data warehouse is immense. Like, whenever like Redshift kind of invented in it came from like 2012, I guess. That's the first time I seen like Redshift kind of started to be used. And there's so much of entry barrier to use big data side of it. And then Redshift kind of giving this layer for the smaller companies to quickly spin off and start to move on the data warehousing style of it. I've seen an increasing pattern nowadays. People are moving away from Redshift, either to Databricks or Snowflake. There's only two GAM. I'm not sure like why Redshift is kind of dropping the ball here. But what do you think, Ashwin?
I think that's an interesting observation. I think I've also seen customers make that shift. Snowflake really made it simple, right, for someone to operate. And I think they took over some of the complexities that were there. I think there were some challenges. I'm sure some of them have been addressed by Redshift as well, but came in a little later in 2022 around locking. And the management of clusters as well was a little complex and tedious as well, right? So while Redshift, as you rightly pointed out, had its run, and it's still a good data warehouse solution. But then that's the industry observation, right? Customers are moving from one to another. It could be a combination of factors. The ease of use of Snowflake contributes definitely. Support for a lot of lake houses, like Snowflake now supports Iceberg, so you can now do lake house based patterns on top of Snowflake. The governance is something that they kind of standardize, at least on the access side. So I think probably that leads customers to migrate. But the topic around migration is key, right? One thing I think both me and Anand, and then probably a lot of you listening to this podcast, have gone through in our careers. We would have gone through at least 2 or 3 migrations, right? Moved from Teradata to Hadoop to cloud warehouses to another better cloud warehouse. So migration is the only constant that I say in the business of data. In every 3 years, we'll be migrating to something better. Today is Snowflake. Tomorrow, we do not know what it is going to be. So how you approach migration is the key aspect here. In this blog, I think the author basically discussed about their architecture, the number of Airflow jobs that they have, and what they were using for reporting and analytics. Largely an AWS-based ecosystem. I think because of the technical challenges and limitation that they had faced with Redshift around isolation, around blocking mechanisms and manageability of clusters, they moved on to Snowflake. But then the approach they followed was very active one, right? I don't know, Anand, if it's the right approach, if you've observed anything else. They're basically migrating and managing both the systems for like close to a year before everything gets sorted out and then move from there. What do you
Yeah,
see?
yeah, I've seen the similar pattern, and I have done it personally for many
Okay.
times. Like, a friend of mine in Slack used to joke around, like, as a data team, we have always something to migrate.
Yeah,
So
true.
there'll be at least one migration project always there. I think one of the interesting note of anybody listening to this conversation, if you're building a team, a successful team always do a clean migration. I think that's a very important characteristics of an efficient team. There's always something better to move. Your business dynamics changes. You wanted to have newer capabilities to do that. But the key critical part is like clean migration. If you left like, 1% of my data is still in Redshift and 99% of your data in Snowflake, you're essentially, um, degrading your velocity and then the quality of your delivery here. Right? And that's kind of a conversation they have that, and especially a migration like this, especially a database migration is no easy feat. It'll take like at least 9 to 1 year. I'm not really surprised about the timeline because database is the nuclear of everything, and it has that interface that connected to any of your dashboarding tools. So if you're moving away from Redshift to another tool, then you have to make sure that your dashboards are working fine. And no two databases are supporting the same SQL. So there has to be some fixes needs to be done in your thing. And now you're moving from one target to another target. Now you have to do a source to destination comparison all the time to make sure the data is adhered to the same quality or even better, what is really missing there. So you cannot do like all in one. You cannot do like, switching, switch off and switch on a database. So it has its own process all the way down, and there's an ecosystem around that has also need to adjust around that one. So I think kudos to the team. They're kind of taking that approach and take a time and then done a great migration.
Yeah, I think you stressed on the SQL functions. Interestingly, the team here, what they have done, they have developed a SQL parser and they have
Right.
open sourced it as well. So I think it's available for download. If I'm not wrong, the blog has the link. So they
Yes.
developed a custom parser, particularly to address, right? So because the SQL that you write on top of Redshift doesn't necessarily work on top of Snowflake. Some SQL functions are different and how you parse JSONs are different between both the tools. So they've built a parser to help you to convert. Now, the other part, Anand, is around when you migrate, one of the things that you spend a lot of time on is testing. How do people approach this testing, right? So they have to keep both systems on and then do testing. How do you think people should approach that particular problem statement?
Testing in terms of like the data
Migration. Yeah, the
migration.
migration and say, hey, I've loaded 10,000 records here, loaded 10,000 in Redshift today, 10,000 Snowflake, and then the delta is matching. How should people automate it?
Um, so it so it depends upon pipeline to pipeline. So some kind of a domain understanding required, what pipeline that we are moving out of it. The usual strategy, what we usually do, this is not necessarily true to a database to database, right? Even in model, you might develop one data set or one table, and then you might iterate to another table version. You might want to break the backward compatibility at some point of a time, moving to a different table format. The same philosophy apply here, right? Um, it's typically fall into the same source to destination validation. The approach that I have seen is like simple count. Initially, like, okay, is the count is matching? You cannot, like, depends upon the upstream guarantees, the count may or may not match all the time. The second approach, I take some kind of a sampling and then say like, okay, I take 200 sampling here, 200 sample data here. Is that end-to-end is matching, has a complete matching capabilities there?
Yeah.
And the sampling also kind of vary, depends upon the domain understanding of it. For example, if it is SaaS business, usually account-based business, so usually you sample one particular client or 5 different particular clients and take all the data and compare these clients versus that clients. So more of a targeted sampling approach. I think those are like go for first table statistics. How many nulls, data profiling is your very first step. and then go deeper level
Perfect.
on the auditing perspective. Can I compare the whole table again with industry table? Usually not the case. You may not have the luxury to do that. Then obvious choice is applying sampling, right? So, and then what sampling technology, what sampling methodology I should have? Can I randomly pick one? Is it just like users? Is it a user specific, or is there any specific, or any dimension that play a prominent role that you wanted to pick and choose and sample around that? So some cases it may not be like a one sampling might work, like you might have 2-3 targeted sampling to do that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the team here, they've used data fold to kind of do the data parity testing.
Right.
But that's on the data. One of the things about migration projects, one of my very first jobs was migrating to Cognos, is the BI testing, right? So one is data, which is still an intermediate kind of a table that you can still say, I load it. But then the end consumers only see the BI dashboard. And that SQLs that are written there, right, also kind of fails. And these are all web-based or sometimes thick client-based. And that is a very hard migration. In this case, I think they've used Mode as a BI tool. And they basically say the APIs weren't so great to automate and change parameters. So they ended up using a Chrome plugin. Developing a Chrome plugin, changing the parameters, and then performing the migration. I think they use Chrome tools. They did not develop a Chrome plugin. They leverage Chrome tools to basically automate a bit on the migrating the BI landscape.
Right, exactly. I think data migration itself is a bigger topic on its own.
Yeah, if somebody wants to build a company and be relevant for the next 20, 30 years, I think just specialize on migration, right? Yeah. Be an expert on helping customers lift and shift.
Yeah, I think Datafold is kind of trying to address a similar problem. Right? They also use the Datafold here, and maybe a database to database from one model to another model. I think there's always a migration that has to be done. So I think that's a very handy tool, Data. We used to have back at Slack. We used to have some custom tooling around that. So you just need to find out base table and target table, and we can just define your YAML structure, what is your hypothesis, and just automatically run and build it. I think it's a necessary tool for every company. There will be something there. Whether it's an independent product, that's a different question. But I think it's a must-have handy tool.
Yeah, totally. I think even there's a lot of you can't automate everything, so you need to think of a lot of strategies and help reduce the cost of migration. I think sometimes people don't make the move because they are afraid of the cost of migration and breaking what works today. Right?
Yeah, totally. With this, we kind of come to an end of Data Engineering Weekly discussion on 122. Sorry, 121. Until next time, we'll see edition 122 with some exciting articles. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye.